The Harley rolled down the road like a living animal, its engine rumbling through the quiet valley until every sound in town folded into it. Dust rose behind the bike and lingered in the sunset, turning red and gold before falling into gray. The sky burned at the edges of the horizon, and the town below seemed to shrink into its own silence. Rains rode through that silence without looking left or right. He had seen that look too many times before, windows closing, curtains twitching, people stepping back. The small main street of the town stretched ahead of him, empty, except for the thin hum of an overhead wire and the slow rotation of a windmill far off behind the barn roofs. When he cut the engine, the silence that followed was heavier than the sound. He let the bike rest against the curb and took off his helmet. The air smelled of old wood and dust, and the faint sweetness of something burning far away. Maybe hay, maybe someone's dinner. His hair was damp with sweat from the long ride. The leather jacket stuck to his arms where the sun had baked it. The patch on his back, Hell's Angels, gleamed dull in the last light. Above it, the name stitched across his chest, read Reens. He stood still long enough for the town to make its decision. A man sweeping the porch of a hardware store froze and turned his head away. Two children who had been chasing each other down the street disappeared inside a doorway. A door slammed, sharp as a gunshot. Rains walked toward the general store. His boots sank slightly in the dust, each step slow and deliberate. The porch creaked when he climbed the 3 wooden steps. Inside, an old man behind the counter glanced up, met his eyes for a heartbeat, then dropped his gaze to the register. Rains nodded once, not expecting an answer. He had long stopped expecting them. He sat down on the top step of the porch. His elbows rested on his knees, his gloved hands folded together. The town lay before him like a photograph, still, faded, waiting to be left alone. The neon sign above the window blinked on. It buzzed unevenly. Open, N, Ope. Each flicker made a small hum that filled the space between his breaths. He stared at his reflection in the window glass and barely recognized the man looking back. The beard was gray now, the lines around the mouth deep enough to hold shadows. The blue eyes that used to be quick and steady were distant, as if they belonged to someone watching from another room. It had been years since anyone looked into those eyes without flinching. He looked down at his hands. The knuckles were rough, scarred, tattooed in faded black. He rubbed his thumb across a burn mark near the wrist, an old souvenir from the workshop he used to run. The memory came uninvited. The smell of oil, the radio playing soft country songs, the sound of a woman laughing from across the small garage. Sarah had always laughed with her whole body, head tilted, eyes shining like she knew a secret. Lucy used to sit beside the toolbox, swinging her legs, trying to hum the same song. He could almost hear them both now, the laughter folding into the rhythm of a life that no longer existed. The sound broke inside his mind, the way glass breaks under weight, tires screeching, metal twisting, a horn that never stopped, the flash of red lights, the wet sound of rain on asphalt. Then nothing. He blinked hard. Once, twice, forcing the image to dissolve. The town came back into focus. The porch, the flickering neon, the smell of dust. Somewhere across the street, a door opened. A woman stepped out carrying a grocery bag. When she saw him, her body went still. For a second, their eyes met. Then she crossed the street quickly, her footsteps sharp on the pavement. The grocery bag shifted against her hip. She didn't look back. He lit a cigarette. The lighter clicked, a small sound in the large, quiet smoke curled up, pale against the deepening blue of the evening. He watched it twist and fade. He wasn't angry. Fear was simple. Fear was clean. It told people what to do. He had lived long enough to understand that the town smelled different at nightfall. The air cooled, carrying hints of rain that would never reach the ground. The dust settled again on his boots. Somewhere a dog barked once, low and uncertain. He took another drag and let the smoke drift out slowly. The horizon darkened, that copper glow fading into bruised violet. The road he came from stretched back into shadow. He could leave now, ride until the sky changed again. No one would remember he had been here, but he stayed. Maybe it was the quiet, or the way the sunset reflected on the chrome of his bike, or maybe he was simply too tired to keep running from towns that hated his kind. Whatever it was, he stayed seated on those wooden steps and listened to the small sounds of a town pretending not to breathe. Through the glass, he could see the storekeeper pretending to count coins. The old man's hands shook slightly. Rains looked down and exhaled. The cigarette burned almost to the filter. He crushed it against the porch rail, leaving a gray mark that would stay there until rain washed it away. The clock inside the shop showed 7. The second hand ticked with a rhythm that reminded him of a heart. His, theirs, the world's. It didn't matter. Everything kept beating, even after it broke. A screen door opened somewhere behind him. Voices whispered, "Hell's angels." "Big one?" He didn't turn. The sound of the wind changed. "Don't want trouble." The night settled deeper. The first star blinked faintly over the roof of the post office. He thought of Sarah again, but her quiet. She had a way of filling silence that made it feel safe. Even the shop radio would lower itself when she was near. He hadn't known peace like that since. He rubbed a hand over his face, rough against the beard, and felt the years sitting heavy in the motion. The door behind him opened once more. The bell above it rang. The same old man's voice came out, careful, polite. "You'll scare folks." Sitting there like that, Rains didn't answer. He looked up at the street light above him, its halo glowing against a swarm of insects. The dust in the air shimmered like faint rain. The town looked suspended, half alive, half waiting to forget. He could have stood up. He could have walked to his bike, started the engine, and left the way he came, but he didn't. Instead, he stayed perfectly still, listening to the heartbeat of a place that wished he wasn't there. The neon sign flickered again. "Open, in, op." He watched the light pulse against the glass until it looked almost like breathing. The hum of the sign filled the silence, steady and broken all at once. It sounded human in a way no one else did anymore. Rains leaned back slightly, resting against the post. His shadow stretched down the steps and across the dusty street like a second body made of night. He didn't know why he stayed. Maybe he was waiting for something he'd stopped believing in years ago. An accident of kindness. A voice that didn't judge before it spoke. For now, there was only the hum of the sign, the faint ticking of the clock, and the soft weight of dust on his boots. He breathed in. The air tasted of metal and quiet. And for the first time in a long while, he did not move. The town held its breath with him. No one knew it yet, but beneath the leather and the scars, something small had begun to stir. A heartbeat that refused to die, waiting for a reason to rise again. The neon still breathed behind him, that broken hum like a machine trying to learn the rhythm of a living thing. Night had taken the street and laid it out in soft strips of shadow. Rains remained on the top step a long moment, letting the quiet press against his shoulders until it felt like weight he could hold instead of dodge. Through the window he watched the store clock mark the minutes with its dry little tick. The glass sent back a faint reflection of leather and beard and pale eyes in a face wind-burned by too many roads. He rubbed the heel of his hand over the seam above his heart. The leather there had softened with use, shaped by distance and heat, and the grind of days. The name stitched across it showed heavy in the flat light. Letters thick as cord, the color of smoke. Rains. A tool he had reached for when grief made every other thing fall from his hand. It worked. It kept people out. It had kept even him at a distance from the man still standing under it. He rose and let the jacket settle, the big patch across his back, curving like a warning. The weight of that patch was nothing until a stranger read it. Then it added pounds he could feel in his neck and jaw. He drew a slow breath and tasted metal and old sun on chrome. The bell over the door struck a thin note when he went inside. Fluorescence buzzed, turning the room a weary white. The aisles smelled of paper, coffee left too long on a hot plate, sugar dust clinging to candy in glass jars. The floor took his boot steps and gave them back as whispers. The old man behind the counter glanced up and down in the same breath. His hands found work that did not need doing. The refrigerator near the back rattled like a patient with a stubborn cough. Rains opened it, the seal unpeeling with a rubbery sigh, and took a bottle of water. At the counter he placed it on the glass and waited. "That it?" the old man asked, his voice even yet pitched a shade high. "That is it." Keys clacked. The drawer sounded off with a tired snap. Coins chimed and went still. Rain slid bills across, warm from his pocket. The old man lifted them, careful not to touch his fingers. Paper fed through a small machine and came out as a receipt. Rains left it there. Paper proof did not change a thing for a man with his jacket. "You watch yourself," the old man said, not unkind, as if reciting a rule that kept everyone from having to say more. "Some folks get nervous after dark." "Me too," Rains said, and left before the words could grow edges. Outside, the wood step breathed under his weight. He broke the seal and drank, the water cold and clean as a small mercy. When he finished, he set the bottle beside his boot, like he was saving a seat for a guest, not yet brave enough to join him. Crickets set a steady rhythm beyond the post office. Somewhere a metal pail tipped, rolled, and came to rest. Dust floated in the cone of the street lamp and turned slow as tired snow. The town had the held breath shape of a body pretending to sleep. His left glove squeaked when he flexed his hand. The leather wanted oil. He thought of the small jar he used to keep above the bench, the bristles splaying against hide, the way the jacket drank and darkened and forgave weather. He had once been good at tending to what wore down. You listen, you trace the lines, you clear what is clogged, you tighten what is shaken loose, you replace what is past saving, and you do not lie about it. He set his palm flat to the stitched name, not for the feel of thread, but for the man that lived behind it. He was Rains to them, a shape to avoid, but inside the leather Eli still counted the empty places at his table. The counting never lost its place. A moth tapped the window and left flour on the glass. The neon coughed and found its hum again. He saw the old shop the way you see a place you could walk through blind. A car under a blue tarp, a radio low, steel guitar speaking its clean ache, Sarah coming in with a paper sack and a look that changed the weather, Lucy sliding behind, shoes squeaking on wet concrete, hair refusing any ribbon. He wiped his hands in memory, oil leaving black maps on a rag. Lucy once pressed that rag to her little nose and said her father smelled like engines and dreams. The line returned like a light no one had remembered to turn off. Pain passed through him like weather he did not resist. He had learned to stand still for it, to let it move on without taking the rest of him with it. The bottle sweated a small ring into the dust, a dark coin already fading. On the highway past town, a truck rolled by, sound dragging light behind it. It slowed, then moved on. The driver did not look. He had already seen what he needed to see stitched across a stranger's chest. Rains sat again and undid the snaps at his cuffs. He pulled the gloves free by their fingers, one and then the other, and laid them side by side with their seams facing the road. Air on his hands felt honest. He turned his left palm up and traced the shiny ridge of an old burn near the thumb. He could date it by the lesson it had taught: a belt, a reach mistimed, a hiss, a bowl of water held steady by Sarah's small, steady hands, while he kept his curses in his throat, so the child would not store them. He breathed on the window by accident and fogged the word open into 3 unsteady parts. He could have drawn a line through the mist and made it whole again. He left it be. From inside came the scratch of a pen on a clipboard that did not need marking. He knew the little dances of avoidance men performed when fear and habit negotiated a truce. Along the street, porch lights woke by timer, one rectangle, then another, each throwing its square of gold onto empty chairs. The quiet choreography steadied him. Patterns still existed. Not everything hurt simply because it could. He closed his eyes and opened them before a new memory could rush him. The worst hurt hid in ordinary minutes, the ones dressed up like routine and trying to pass as safe. He kept his gaze on the road and counted a breath until the wave went under. A breeze ran the dust low at his boots and lifted the hem of the jacket until the liner brushed his ribs. The touch felt closer than he was ready for. He set his palm there as if to keep himself from leaking out. Then he eased his hand inside, into the inner pocket, not seeking the lighter, not seeking anything sharp with corners. He was hunting the opposite of knife and key, something soft he could hold without bracing. His fingers found the small mend in the lining, where a tear had given way years back. Sarah had tightened it in 2 neat rows. The thread was tiny and stubborn and truer than any promise made with a crowd listening. He traced that mend the way the stitch moved with the beating under his palm. He had carried this patch a long time. It had held better than the man. He drew his hand out empty. For the first time in too long, he felt the exact shape of what was missing. He could not have named it if a judge had asked, but he knew its texture. Not metal, not paper, not a hard edge. Something soft, something living, something that did not cut when you reached for it. The absence of that softness sat in his chest like a room waiting for a lamp to be lit. He let the jacket fall closed. The zipper teeth whispered as he drew them together halfway, a sound like 2 halves of a thing agreeing to meet in the middle. He touched the letters again and felt the thread give a little under the warmth of his hand. Behind the glass, the old man coughed and cleared his throat, as if remembering the shop belonged to him after all. The bell rang and the door eased open an inch and then shut. A check on the air. "You need anything else?" the old man asked through wood and habit. "No," Rains said to the street, and the answer seemed to satisfy them both. He fixed the gloves, lining finger to finger, a small ritual to prove he could still make order when nothing asked for it. He noted the split seam on the right cuff and imagined a needle in a quiet room. A lamp, time enough to mend a single line. The thought felt almost like a kindness, so he set it down before it could feel like a promise. The bottle had cooled against his boot. He tilted the last swallow, then pinched the plastic until it cracked with a dry relief. He set it by the post, light now, ready to move at a breath. Across the street, a radio woke and died in the same second, as if someone had tried to pour sound into the night and changed their mind. Porch rectangles held. Insects worked the light. The town's breath went on in its slow count. Something in him rose without moving his body. Not hope. That word had broken. The night metal broke the world. Not even prayer. Though he had whispered the word peace to open skies on lonely hills and felt nothing answer but wind, this was smaller and more stubborn. It had no name, and that was why it could live where words could not. The door behind him opened once more, and the bell sliced the quiet into two clean pieces. He did not turn. He felt the night change and heard what changed it. A light step, soft and certain, touched the dust and came on. He did not brace. He only breathed. The leather warm against his skin, the stitched name a steady weight, the counted grief. A steady flame that neither swelled nor dimmed, and the long road behind him humming like a vein under the skin of the dart. The light footfall that reached him did not sound like fear. It sounded like a question testing the edge of a dark pool. Rains kept his eyes on the road because habit made the world easier to sort that way. But the step came closer, soft on dust, soft on wood, and then stopped just below his knee. He looked down. A little girl stood at the bottom step, with her small boots turned slightly inward, as if the earth were a doorway too grand for her, and she was deciding whether to knock. She wore a denim vest, a size too big over a dress, the color of early roses. Her hair had been braided with care, though a few strands had already slipped free and traced their own small map across her forehead. In her hand she held a flower, a pink one, its petals not yet tired from the day. "Hello?" she said. Her voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who has not learned to apologize for being present. Rains did not answer at once. The leather across his shoulders seemed to tighten as if it, too, had heard a word it had not expected. He swallowed and found a voice somewhere behind the grit of the road. "Hey there, you look sad," she said. He had been called large, loud, trouble. Worse, sad felt like a hand placed lightly between his shoulder blades to steady him while he stepped down from something too high. He searched for the correct reply and came up empty. He looked at the flower instead. It held the pink of late daylight on an old blind. The stem was thin as a promise. The petals trembled because her hand trembled, and her hand trembled because she was brave. The town went breathless around them. The neon kept humming. Insects worked the light. Crickets counted time beyond the post office. All of it slid to the edges. The center was a child on the step with a flower, and a man who felt a dozen kinds of breaking, and none of them quite fatal. She scuffed the wood with the toe of one boot and lifted the flower toward him. She did it carefully, as though she were offering a bird that might spook. "This is for you," she said. He did not reach. Not yet. The petals made a small, trembling cup of color between her fingers. His hands, rough and tattooed and sure about heavy work, had no clear rule for this. A wrench, a belt, a torn line, a leaking seal. Those he understood. He could take them apart and set them right. A kindness. This small had no seam to pry and no screw to turn. It simply waited. "Why?" he asked finally, the word worn with dust and a long sleep. "Because," she said, "my mom says people who look the saddest need the most love." The sentence moved through him, the way shallow sun moves over water, throwing brief, bright shapes on a floor of stone. A part of him had not been touched by any hand in a long while. That part leaned toward the warmth without first checking for a fall. He reached out. The gloves were off. His fingertips came near the flower and paused, as if asking permission. She did not pull back. He took the stem where her own fingers left off. The weight surprised him. It weighed almost nothing, which made it feel like everything else he had been carrying. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome," she answered, and smiled the kind of smile that keeps no ledger. He lifted the flower. The scent reached him after the sight, a soft, clean sweetness under the evening dust. It was not strong. It was not meant to be. It was the kind of scent you catch only when you are close enough to be careful. "What is your name?" he asked. "Because a stranger who hands you steadiness deserves to be known." "Lucy," she said. The name struck him like a soft thing thrown from far away. and making the distance anyway. He kept his face from changing. He kept his hands from showing the tremor that wanted to start. He held still the way a man holds still when a live wire hums at ear height and the room is full of fuel. "Nice name," he said, and meant it all the way down. She rocked on her heels and studied his jacket. Her eyes traced the letters and then came back to his. "Is Rains your name?" she asked. He had answered that question many times with a nod and a wall. Tonight he answered it once with a breath and a door almost closed. "It is the one I wear. What about the one inside?" she asked, as if an inventory of truth were a normal porch conversation, before he could decide how to carry that. A woman's voice crossed the street, tight with apology and alarm. "Sweetheart, come here now." The girl did not startle. She turned and lifted a hand to show that she had heard, a gesture that promised cooperation to both sides of the night. "I have to go," she told him. Then, with a seriousness that fit her too well to have been borrowed, she added, "Do not be sad anymore." "Okay." He could not laugh, so he let his mouth learn a small upward line. "I will try," he said. "Promise," she said. That single word, spoken with the weight only children carry without strain, made a clean sound inside him, like a key set gently on a table. "I will try," he said again, and the repeat turned the words into a promise because they had gained weight. She nodded once and ran toward the voice. The mother met her halfway, one arm a shelter and a boundary in the same motion. The woman looked at him over the child's head, eyes wide with a caution that had less to do with him than with every story the world had taught her to keep a small person safe. He lifted the hand that did not hold the flower, slow and empty, a shape meant to be seen from a distance. The woman gave a little nod, something that could have been thanks or only relief. They went inside a house whose porch light made a bright square on the boards. The door closed softly. The rectangle of light held. The step took his weight when he sat again. He raised the flower by the stem and studied the tiny architecture of the petals. Each one tapered to a soft tip the wind could not quite find. He turned it in the shallow light. The color carried a meaning he did not have words for. It was not young and not old. It was a tender kind of stubborn. He brought the petals near his face, and another tone of scent reached him, faint and green, like a first promise hidden in clean water. He let that scent rest between one breath and the next. Then he did something he had not done since a voice told him there would be no more laughter on the far side of a windshield. He placed the flower into the inner pocket of his jacket, as if the pocket had been made for it, as if the lining had kept that exact shape waiting for longer than he wanted to count. The petals brushed the mend Sarah had sewn, and the touch sent a quiet current through him, soft against stubborn, living against thread. He left his palm over the pocket and felt the lightest pressure rise into his hand, like a heartbeat that does not expect company. A small presence moved there now, not heavy enough to bruise, not loud enough to frighten. It did not erase the steady count of loss. It did not cover it. It stood beside it and did not flinch. He watched the street with that new weight in his chest and saw that the town had not changed. The neon worried the same few letters. Insects kept their orbits. Porch rectangles held, yet the shape of the night had shifted a fraction in a direction that eased the shoulders. The store door opened, and the old man leaned on the jamb as if the wood needed him to stand. He looked at Rains, then at the quiet around him, then at the hand resting on the jacket. "You all right?" the old man asked, the words scratched up from a throat, not used for this kind of asking. "I will be," Rains said, and the certainty surprised the one who spoke it. The old man looked as if he might mention daughters or careful or night. He did not. He nodded. Not the polite dip from earlier, but a real one that begins behind the eyes, and went back inside. The bell rang. The door settled. Rain stayed. The road beyond the post office sent a single car like a slow thought. Far fields let a coyote speak, and then took the sound back. The night eased another fraction. He remembered the girl's boots, the way they scuffed, and then stood. He remembered the stems tremble, and how bravery looks like shaking until you look close and see it is only the body telling the truth about how hard a good thing is to do. He let the picture repeat until it softened into a shape he could carry. He thought of Sarah and then of the girl again, and refused to stack those thoughts as weight. He set them side by side, one memory and one living moment, and allowed them to be neighbors rather than a tower that might fall. He drew the jacket closer. The zipper teeth met with that small whisper that had begun to feel like a ritual. The pocket warmed. The mended seam warmed. Beneath the leather, the flower rode the slow tide of his breath and did not bruise. He adjusted his hand so the petals would have room. The mother and child did not appear again. They did not need to. The scene had already finished its work. Rains felt the first clean trace of a new rule take root, something that would not contradict the old rule of loss, but would live with it, and now and then ask it to move over. A wind came, and did not quite become a wind. It carried the hint of rain, although the night had already decided it would not keep that promise. Dust lifted from the road and settled again like a chest pressed by careful hands. Down the block, a screen door knocked once as someone tested it, peered out, and let it fall back. The test answered the question that had asked all evening. The biker was still there. The town was still itself. Nothing had broken that could not later be mended. Nothing had mended that had not first been broken. He leaned his head against the post and closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to allow the inside to come up and meet the outside without a fight. When he opened them, the sky held the same stars, but one seemed steadier. That was not the heavens. That was him. The neon stitched the word open once more and held it longer than it had before. He watched it keep the letters together. He watched it let them go. He touched the pocket with 2 fingers to be sure the flower had not been a trick. It pressed back with the smallest proof a person can need. He breathed, and the jacket breathed with him. He did not know what the sun would bring. He did not know whether the town would soften past this night or harden again and make him earn every inch he had not asked for. He knew only that a child had crossed a distance grown men could not name and placed a light thing in a dark pocket, and the pocket had accepted the weight and called it good. He sat with that new weight while the night did its slow work. Crickets played the town toward late. The far truck line stitched the road to the horizon. Porch lights kept their patient squares. Dust settled into the familiar drawings it makes whenever the air forgets to move. Rains did not move either. He let the flower teach his hand where to rest. He let the quiet teach his breath how to go in and out without argument. He let that unassuming color teach his eyes how to hold a living thing and not look away. Do not be sad anymore. The girl had said. He did not promise the impossible. He promised the next true thing and then the next. He would try. He was trying now. On the far edge of town, a dog barked twice and decided there was nothing left to guard against. The neon hummed. The road lay quiet. The jacket warmed. Under his palm, the petals held like a soft heart and asked for nothing but room. He left the porch when the town's quiet had settled into something that sounded like breath. The neon behind him stitched the word open one last time, and then let the night own itself. He walked to the Harley, laid a hand on the bar as if greeting a shoulder, and swung into the familiar posture of a man who has moved this way longer than he cares to measure. The engine turned and caught, a low animal sound smoothed by distance. He idled down the narrow main street without hurry, letting the porches and their obedient rectangles of light slide past like slow pages. Then the houses gave way to fields. The air took on the clean dryness of cut grass and warm dirt. He rode until the town was only a few scattered freckles of orange in the far dark, and then he turned onto a pale track that might once have been a driveway. Gravel softened. Tires found hard earth. The headlight found a little rise above a drainage ditch, and stopped there as if the ground itself had called for stillness. He killed the engine. The sudden quiet felt earned. Crickets lifted their thin music. Something small went whispering through the grass. He set the kickstand with a gentle boot and waited for the tilt to settle. Then he took off his helmet and let the air touch his scalp. Cool and honest, he stood a moment with both hands braced against the small of his back, easing one stubborn knot, and looked out across the fields to where the sky opened like a dark sea, salted with cold flowers. He moved, because moving calmed the body. He gathered what the day had dried and left, not hunting, just accepting. A few brittle stems, a handful of twigs, the honest labor of small tasks steadied his breath. He placed 3 stones in a circle on bare dirt, where nothing living would mind a little heat, and with the care he used to save for timing chains, he built a tidy nest. He checked the wind by feel alone, and cleared a wider ring, a simple respect a man wears like boots. When his hand slipped toward his inner pocket for the lighter, it paused. The flower lay there where he had tucked it, soft against the old mend Sarah had sewn. He did not take it out. He pressed his palm once, feeling living softness share a pocket with stubborn thread, then let his hand find the lighter. A spark, a brief orange stitched across his knuckles, and the nest accepted the flame. He fed it little, patient offerings until the fire learned to breathe without help. Heat gathered into a small letter of light, legible even to a man who had forgotten how to read his own heart. He crouched and watched as kindling lifted to coal. Sparks scribbled upward, messages only the night could read. Resin sweetened the air. The fire spoke in clicks and low sighs, using the same grammar it has used since the first lonely person asked for company that would not ask questions. When the stones had warmed and the tongue of flame steadied, he stood and slid his fingers to the collar of his jacket. For a heartbeat his hands hung there. He had worn this leather through seasons that felt like verdicts and built a name to match it. He drew the zipper down. The teeth made their small, honest music. He peeled the jacket from his shoulders and felt the night touch him in a way that was not demand, not judgment, only recognition. He folded the jacket with care and set it on a flat stone within reach. No longer armor, not yet a relic. His palm found the pocket once more and felt the flower answer back in its small and steady way, a heartbeat that had learned his tide. He left the jacket there and let the air take the place it had covered. He sat cross-legged because that was a posture that confessed no intention to run. Ground heat rose through denim and bled into him with a kind of instruction. He let his hands rest open on his thighs and breathed until breath belonged to him again. Sarah came, not as a wound, and not as a performance. She arrived the way an ordinary thought visits a kitchen door and knocks once. He saw her tying her hair with a strip of cloth torn from an old shirt. He heard her foot on the shop steps, the way she would touch the rail, as if speaking to the wood in passing. He saw Lucy skimming across concrete in socks, catching herself with a squeak that always ended in laughter. He did not sharpen any of it into a blade. He let the pictures sit where they belonged, small, perfect, finished, loved. He leaned toward the fire and spoke in a voice shaped for listening rather than proof. Peace, he said. He tasted the word and found that it did not need any more polish than that. Peace for the small, brave soul who crossed a distance tonight with her hand open. Peace for the mother who held a boundary without building a wall that could never come down. Peace for the old shopkeeper who remembered how to ask if another person is all right. Peace for the town, for the fear it learned and the quiet it mistook for safety. Peace for the two names that still ring when called inside his chest. Peace for these hands that want to spend themselves on work that refuses to break. He laid each line where it belonged, and added no more than the fire could carry. The prayer sounded like a mechanic's checklist spoken to the dark, simple, exact, without flourish, faithful to use. The fire lowered itself a step. He fed it a little and let it decide the rest. Heat feathered his face. A night bird tried a single question from across the ditch, and then seemed satisfied by the silence that followed. He unrolled a small canvas from the bike and sat on it because he respected the ground's habit of taking a man faster than he expects. He did not intend to sleep. He intended to be still. The body understands the difference. He lifted his eyes. The stars did not arrive as witnesses. They arrived like workers beginning a quiet shift. He could name a few and forgave himself the rest. Names were not the point. The point was that their patient light asked for no argument. He spoke again. Let me be steady. The way a good motor is steady when timing is true. Let me be useful where noise has drowned the sound of care. Let me carry without pretending I am the only one who can. Let me put this name to work, without letting it bury the one beneath it. If there is a turn in this road that is not only distance, show me the dirt track, and I will take it slow. He did not name who should hear it. He trusted the way the night received the sound and did not return it. That was enough. He arranged the coals with a stick the way he arranged parts when a tune belonged to the thing but needed a hand to find it. Each ember tapped into a place where it could keep another warm. He rinsed his fingers with a sip of water, observing the old rule that says a person should not wear a flame he does not mean to carry. Time walked by without keeping score. He let the memory of a small hand offering a bright thing pass through him until memory and present shared a single breath. He heard his own promise as he had spoken it under porch light. I will try. Out here the words thickened into something with bone. A man cannot promise a future he cannot see. A man can promise the next true thing and then the next. He did not reach for the jacket. He let the lack of it be something he was not wearing. He let the weight in its pocket be something he was. He took the place where armor had sat and did not demand thanks. The flower's presence became a held note behind the ribs, not loud, not shy, true as tide. He chose not to count what had happened, and not to rehearse what might. He sat in the small republic of light, and made a simple treaty with the dark. He would try. He would work. He would listen more than he would prove. He would let softness ride with stubbornness, and would not ask one to win. When the fire had eaten what he had given and sat down to glow, he stayed until the last bright settled. He scattered the coals with care and pressed the last arguing spark into silence with the heel of his boot, then stood a moment to be sure the ground could wake with no scar. He lifted the jacket with both hands, less for weight than as a kind of respect, and held it to his chest long enough to feel the small press through leather. In that press the man beneath the names straightened by a measure no one else could see. He did not put the jacket on, not yet. He slung it over his shoulder and let the night keep touching the place it had covered. He breathed in and out and let the quiet keep the count. He walked back to the bike. Grass whispered. A single pebble clicked and lay still. He looked once at the ring of stones, now ordinary as any earth, and gave it the nod we give a task done clean. He sat the way he had earlier, but the dark no longer felt like a room with no doors. It felt like a hand cupped around a small light, so wind could not steal it. He did not ask the sky for an answer. He did not wait for a sign. He let the last of the heat graze his face and allowed his eyes to fill, not as a flood, but as a clear well meeting its brim. The knight kept his secret and shared it with no one. The last ember went to ash. His eyes were wet. Morning rose in a pale wash that lifted the fields out of shadow and laid a cool sheen across the road. Rains rode back toward town at an easy pace, the Harley speaking in a low voice that did not disturb birds working the ditches. The air tasted new. The knight had promised nothing beyond the next true thing, and he could live with that. He eased off the throttle at the edge of the main street and let the bike roll the last yards in quiet. Shop fronts faced the young sun, their windows holding light like bowls. He set the bike by the general store and listened to the town before the town remembered it should be afraid. A kettle rattled somewhere. A dog tapped a screen door with its tail. The clock inside the shop ticked with the calm of a small machine that knows its job. His palm settled over the jacket where the flower rode in the inner pocket, and the soft press answered back. He let his hand drop and looked for what needed a hand. Across the way, a fence leaned into the street as if night had pushed on it. 3 boards had popped their nails, and a 4th hung by a single stubborn bite of metal. The yard beyond held only weeds and an empty barrel, but the crooked line dragged the eye and made the place look like it had given up. Rain stepped to the fence and tested the boards with his fingers. A gentle push here, a lift there, the way a mechanic listens with his hands before opening any cover. He went to the saddlebag and unrolled a small wrap of tools. The leather was tired and the ties were cracked, but the steel inside was honest. He took a hammer, a short pry, and a pocket of nails. He worked at the far end first, where the boards still kept their shape. He eased bent nails out without tearing grain, pressed each plank back into true, and drove clean new bites through wood into post. Every strike kept its temper. A good nail does not need persuasion, only direction and a steady decision. He felt eyes on him and did not look up. The rhythm of the hammer found its own count and turned into a kind of speech. A board seated, another squared, the last one lifted and sighted against the straight line of the road and the far horizon. He set it where it belonged and let the wood rest in its own peace. When he had done enough, he stepped back and wiped his thumb across a nail head, as if signing it. The fence held a straight edge now. It would stand through weather and worry. His shoulder rolled once, and the jacket creaked. His hand drifted to the pocket without thinking. The flower felt like a yes he could carry. The store door opened. The bell gave its single note. The old man stood there with a broom he was not yet ready to push. "You fixing that for anyone in particular?" he asked. "I am fixing it because it needed to be fixed." "Rains," said. The old man looked at the boards, at the nails seated flush, at the neat square of the corner that had sagged. His mouth set into a line that might have been thinking or might have been gratitude that had not yet learned to walk. He nodded once, small but true, and the broom found the boards inside the door. Dust whispered. Farther down the street, a pickup would not start. The hood stood open like a mouth, and a man in a cap stared at the engine, as if reading a language he had never wanted to learn. Rains wiped his hands on a rag and walked over until he stood where the light fell into the bay. The man flicked his eyes up and then back down. "Trouble?" Rains asked, as if there were any other kind when a machine refused. "Battery is fine," the man said. "Lights work. She only clicks." Rains leaned and listened. The first listen tells you which family a problem belongs to. The second tells you its given name. He touched wires with 2 fingers, gentle as if checking a wrist for a pulse. He followed the line from battery to solenoid, from solenoid to starter. He checked the ground strap where it met the frame, and found it corroded to a chalky disgrace. He held up the strap without blame. "She has forgotten where to send her strength," he said. "Give me a minute." He filed the contact with a small square of sand until bright metal answered. He cleaned the bolt threads, set the strap back, and tightened until firm met firm. He nodded toward the cab. Try her. The engine caught on the second heartbeat and held. The man let out a sound with more relief than faith in it. How much? He asked. Call it a good morning. Rain said. If she acts proud again, shade her, and we will speak to her pride. The man smiled without meaning to, tipped his cap, and drove off. The sound was not a new machine. It was a problem that had remembered its purpose. That was enough. Small work gathered, a hinge that shouted every time the hardware door swung, a bicycle chain dry as wind, a bench leg that had learned a lazy angle. Rains did not call attention to any of it. He looked, he listened, and he used the tools he had to show each thing the line it had wandered from. A drop of oil sent the hinge from shriek to whisper. He spun the wheel until the chain found teeth without complaint. He tapped a wedge into a mortise until the bench stood square. People watched and pretended not to. The old man left the broom and came back with a small paper cup that smelled like coffee, convinced to live again. He held it out without stepping closer than respect allowed. You will want this if you keep punching the morning like that, he said. Rains took the cup and set it on the window ledge, a promise to return when the next thing no longer needed him. From up the block came the cough of a motor trying to climb into breath. A woman stood by a compact car, the hood up, a child seat visible through the back glass. The engine choked and fell off, choked and fell off. He stopped at the fender and waited until she noticed him, because a man who wears his history like a sign does not cross a line without welcome. May I listen? He asked. She hesitated, then stepped aside. He leaned over the bay and breathed the scent that told him how long the car had sat and how much of the town the wind had carried into it. He touched the air intake and followed a vacuum line to a cracked elbow of rubber that sighed under his thumb. This is letting breath go where it should not, he said. Can you fix it? She asked, the question full of a day's math that had not yet balanced. For now, he said. He tore a thin strip from a corner of his rag, wound it tight around the crack, and cinched it with a zip tie from his pocket. He seated the joint until the sigh stopped. Try her. She turned the key and the idle climbed clean and held. She covered her mouth and laughed once, the sound that slips out when fear takes its hands off the wheel. How much? She asked. Bring me the old elbow when you get a new one, he said. We will fit it right. Today we are even. The child in back swung new shoes at the air. He stepped away, and the woman thanked him with a look that seemed surprised to find kindness stubborn enough to hold in daylight. He watched her go, checked the seal once more with 2 fingers, and slid the rag back into his pocket. The flower under it felt like a warm coin. By mid-morning the light had sharpened. The town had remembered itself and tried on its careful face, but habit had trouble settling when benches stood true, and hinges behaved, and engines did what they were made to do. Rains moved down the street with tools in hand, not asking, not selling, promising nothing beyond what he could set right with a nail or a bolt or a breath. Behind the store, the old man waved him toward a lean shed. Got a generator that quits whenever it wants to make a point. He said, I am tired of hearing its opinion. The unit crouched like a stubborn animal, dented where someone had tried to argue with fists. Rains ran his palm along its top as if steadying a dog. He checked fuel. He pulled the plug, eyed the gap, cleaned it, reseated it. He traced the fuel line to a paper filter and tapped. The tap made a hollow complaint. He split the filter and held the halves to the light. The paper was choked with fine dust, the color of the street. She cannot breathe, he said. We choke what we use, and then blame it for remembering. The old man fetched a new filter from a box where parts waited for anyone who knew what question to ask. Rains fit it snug and kind, primed the line, and stepped back. Try her. The generator coughed, thought about it, and found a steady hum that filled the shed. The old man smiled in a way that made his years sit kinder on his face. How much? He asked. Call it even for the water, Rains said, and lifted the cup from the ledge. It had cooled, but it was offered, and so it was good. Noon drew clean lines across the street. Rains wiped his hands and looked at the row of small things that now worked the way small things should. The town did not clap. It did not need to. He felt the change where it mattered, in the angle of a shoulder that did not tighten when it passed, in a good morning that kept its syllables from sounding like a test. He sat on the top step the way he had the night before, but the posture was different. Night had asked whether he would stay. Day asked what he would do next. A door near the grocer eased open a hand's width and stayed there, not hiding, not inviting, only willing to see. Two voices met in a short exchange, the kind that does not turn the air brittle. Someone called out in the plain way used for neighbors. Mister, when you have a minute, the icebox hums wrong. He lifted a hand. I hear it. The old man at the door cleared his throat. You coming back tomorrow? He asked. If there is something to do, Rains said. There always is, the old man answered, as if stating the town's oldest law. Rains looked at his hand, at the half-moons of grit set in the lines, at the black that soap could never quite argue out. He thought of the prayer spoken to the fire, and how it had asked for steadiness rather than forgiveness. His palm found the pocket, and felt the petals warm against the mend. The work of hands, he thought, not penancy, not display, just work. Nails seated, lines trued. Breath returned to machines that had forgotten their purpose. Hinges quieted, doors that opened without complaint. He stood and felt the day seat itself inside him like a gear, finally finding its tooth. The street kept moving. The Harley waited in the kind of shade an engine likes before it gives you its best. He picked up the tool roll and stepped into an afternoon already asking its next polite question. And he answered it the only way that mattered, with the steady language of work. Afternoon laid a warm cloth over the street and turned dust into light. Heat lifted from the road in soft shivers. Rains moved through it with his tool roll and the slow economy of a man who has learned that speed is not the same thing as care. The flower pressed gently against the seam inside his jacket, a small weight where breath touched thread. When his palm drifted there without thinking, it found an answer. The call about the icebox had come from a small grocery 2 doors down from the general store. Its front door stood half open, held by a wooden wedge shaped like a heel. Rains paused on the threshold and let the owner make the first decision. The air inside carried the thin metallic hum of tired machinery and the clean scent of fruit. Come ahead, the grocer said. He was a square man with a careful mustache and a towel over one shoulder. He pointed with his chin toward a back room. The icebox argues in the heat. Listen to where the hum comes from. Rains pushed through a curtain of clear strips that hissed lightly along his sleeves. The back room smelled of citrus and cardboard. A commercial unit crouched against the wall, its vent rattling like a coin in a thin can. He set his palm to the side panel the way you steady a dog, and let the vibration climb bone. The pitch said clogged and overworked. He cut the power, loosened the grate, and lifted off a felted quilt of dust and chaff, stitched there by months of air. He brushed the fins with a small tool, gentle as a steady rain, then set the grate back, slid the machine home, and restored the switch. The hum returned lower, clean, as if the machine had chosen to speak rather than complain. The grocer listened from the doorway as if sound could spook. That is a content note, he said. How much? Rains lifted a hand for water. The grocer pressed a cold glass into it at once. then wrote the next cleaning date in pencil on a square of tape above the switch, speaking the words as he wrote them, so the promise would have a voice. Rains drank and felt cool, moved down like a kind intention finding its work. Outside, the street looked almost the same, but the difference was in how it felt. A window that had been a mirror had become a pane. Someone laughed, and did not lower the sound halfway through. Across the way, a screen door opened a hand's width and stayed, then widened another inch, as if remembering how to welcome. An older woman stepped out with a blue laundry basket and met his eye. "Do you know the trick with a line that sags?" she asked. "I know a few tricks," he said. She led him to a small yard, where a clothesline ran from a post to a hook in the wall. The rope had stretched into a tired smile. He tested the knot and found it honest but overworked. She brought a spare length from a drawer by the back door. He tied a simple loop at the anchor, fed the line through, and shifted the pull, so the strain returned to the right place. The shirts lifted clear of the grass, moving like small sails that had remembered wind. "How much?" she asked. "A single clothespin," he said. She pressed a wooden pin into his palm, warm from the basket. He slid it into his shirt pocket. A little neighbor for the flower's weight inside the leather. A boy coasted by with a playing card ticking in his spokes. He looked at Rains, at the fence he had straightened that morning, at the corner that still held true. He gave a half-wave boys use when they are too busy pretending not to be impressed. Rains touched 2 fingers to his brow in answer. In front of the general store, the old man pulled a crate to the step and sat with a folded paper. He watched over the top edge. While pretending to read, the paper snapped once in a small breeze. He cleared his throat like a man calling a meeting with himself. "The stockroom hinge still remembers how to scream," he said. Rains found the hinge and fed oil into its joint with the corner of a rag, until the idea of pain left the metal. He opened and closed the door with care, until silence became the correct answer. When he stepped back into the light, the old man did not thank him, but his shoulders had lost a pinch they wore most days. Rains walked again, not hunting, only seeing. He bent the tongue of a post-box lock so a key could enter without argument. He leaned his weight into a loose handrail at the barber and coaxed it square. He tightened 2 screws on a shelf in the drugstore and asked nothing. A bottle of cold orange soda appeared on the counter behind him, placed by a hand that did not say his name. He left $1 and carried the bottle outside, drank half, and set it on the sill to sweat. By mid-afternoon, the street breathed easier. The town had not changed its face, only its jaw. A man with a feed cap came for seed and did not pick the far side of the walk. 2 women finished their talk instead of snapping it in half when they saw him. The boy with the bicycle stopped to reset the card, and Rains showed him a better slot near the rim. The wheels sang 1 street over. The boy circled back just to hear it again, and to let the grin have its way. The woman with the compact car pulled in with a motor that sounded sure of itself. She brought a small paper bag from the seat, and did not stare at her shoes as she crossed to him. "For you," she said, "a sandwich from the deli and a slice of pie. The elbow is on order. I will bring it." "Thank you," he said. "It is turkey and mustard," she added. The detail offered like an oath. He waited a polite beat, and then took a bite on the step. The bread was soft, and the mustard honest. He met her eyes and nodded in the plain way of a man choosing to accept. She seemed to stand easier after that. The grocery door stayed open wider than its wedge now. Cooler air crept across the threshold and carried the clean scent of apples. The grocer rolled one toward him along the counter like a coin. Rains caught it and set it near the pie. A red period after a full sentence. A pair of teenagers walked by with paint flecks on their knuckles, uniforms of the volunteer line crew. One tipped his chin toward the far fence at the ball field beyond the hardware. "Loose board," he said. "Not a complaint, not an order, just the kind of information people share when they decide you will use it well." Rains lifted a finger in answer, and the boys went on with a half smile. They did not yet announce to each other. He finished the sandwich, capped the bottle, and wiped his hand. From the little house where the girl lived, a curtain moved. The mother stood behind the glass, not hiding now, not declaring, only measuring the air. She slid the window up 2 inches and left it there. A little later the screen door eased and held on its spring, neither shut nor wide. The hinge made a thin sound that tried to be a protest and settled for an announcement. Rains heard it and stored the job for morning. In the late light, a man across the way called from an open window in the plain tone used for errands and neighbors. "When you have a minute, the porch light at my place flickers." Rains lifted his hand. "I hear it." He walked behind the general store to a lean shed where the generator hummed with yesterday's new steadiness. The old man stood in the doorway with the broom held like a staff. "You coming back tomorrow?" he asked. "If there is something to do," Rains said. "There always is," the old man answered, as if repeating the oldest law a place ever wrote. Rains looked down at his hand. Grit marked the lines like half moons. The black, that soap never fully argued away, had seated under his nails. He thought of the words he had spoken to a small fire, and how they had asked for steadiness rather than absolution. He set his palm on the jacket over the pocket. The petals warmed against the mend. He let the touch stand a second longer than habit allowed, and kept his eyes on the street while he did it. He moved again because the afternoon was not finished with him. He set the grocer's wedge deeper, so the door would not chew a strip of plastic. He turned the strip so it lay along the grain. He walked to the barber and set one last screw by feel. The way you tuck a blanket corner before the room belongs to night. He watched the wind test the trees and listened to wire hum under a settling flock. The town arranged itself by inches. Curiosity stepped forward to the place where fear had been standing. No applause. No verdict, only a pattern shifting toward a better memory. People passed and let their eyes stay on him long enough to prove they were not measuring escape routes. A short voice came from a doorstep and asked if the hinge at the church hall could find its quiet by the weekend. He lifted his hand. "I hear it." The sun lowered. Heat left the road. The flowers settled where his breath rose and fell. Somewhere down the block, a hinge tried one last squeak and then thought better of it. He heard the note that mattered, small and clean, the sound a door makes when it opens and decides to stay that way. Morning slid under the day like a careful hand under still water. Rains ate early, rolled his tools, and followed the street past the feed store, toward the low buildings clustered beyond the ball field. The community center looked modest from the road, a patchwork of rooms folded around a concrete yard. Chalk squares brightened the ground. A sun painted on the wall still held most of its color, where the overhang shielded it from weather. The gate latch clicked when he lifted it, a small sound that felt like permission. He paused just inside the fence and let the place meet him. The air smelled of soap and crayons and something sweet that might have been donated cookies. A woman with a ring of keys at her hip shaded her eyes and studied the jacket. Then the man who wore it, her posture eased by a fraction. "You are the one who set the grocer's machine straight," she said. "The fence downtown, the door that stopped yelling." "Same man," he answered. "Our generator sulks," she said. "The yard fountain sputters like a bad mood. We promised the kids a cleanup day. They are excited. The adults are pretending not to be." He let a small line lift at the corner of his mouth. "Where shall I start?" "Here." she said, and nodded toward a metal box under a lean shade. It purred, faltered, and tried again the way a tired animal rallies, because the people in its care are watching. A cluster of children crowded a chalk hopscotch and peered over their shoulders at the stranger, then pretended to study their squares when he looked back. He took a knee by the generator and set his palm to its top, steadying it the way you calm a dog, before reaching near the sore place. The pitch under the housing said it wanted to help and could not breathe easily. He cut the power, lifted the cover, and laid it on the grass, as if it might bruise. Dust wore the filter like a gray coat. He tapped it once and watched fines drift like heron feathers. He brushed the cage clean, checked the plug gap with the nail of his thumb, and set each piece back where the machine could remember its sense. 2 patient presses on the primer and a nod toward the woman. "Go ahead." She flipped the switch. The unit coughed, chose a note, and held it. The hum settled level and stayed there, a low line under the day. She let out an exhale she had been holding. Better. Rains turned to the spigot at the edge of the yard, where a pipe rose and bent like a joint. He opened the handle. Air spit before any water found its tongue. The stream arrived in fits, coughing grit before thinning to a tired thread. Children drifted closer, in a loose half-circle, some flat-footed, others on their toes, as if a little height might double their view. He loosened the head and set it aside. A wafer of lime had hardened there, stubborn as a lie. He scraped the throat with a flat screwdriver and chased the path open with a length of wire. The washer had cracked into an honest resignation. He swapped it for a soft ring from a tidy packet. He seated the head, turned the handle slowly. Water rose with purpose and drew a clean arc. Not loud, not weak, just right for cups and hands and the small dignity of washing. The smallest child clapped first. That sound tripped the rest. A bright patter rolled across the concrete. A boy in a red shirt stepped beneath the arc and let it darken his front like a badge. He looked at Rains the way boys look at machines that choose to behave. Rains said nothing. He nodded toward the stream and stepped aside so the fountain could be the hero for a breath longer. The woman with the keys lingered in the doorway, arms folded in a posture that might once have been armor. Her face softened, not to a smile yet, but toward one. Rains moved the way a man moves, when the work itself is the speech. Along the back fence, he found the board the teenagers had named the day before. It had shrugged free of the post and sagged. He eased the bent nails out without tearing grain, straightened one on the cap for luck, and drove fresh steel until the plank found home. The hammer's rhythm gave the yard a beat. Children are good at beats. They fell into it. Heels scuffing time, hands on knees, turning fence work into a kind of song. When he looked up, 3 girls had formed a committee beside the net, which hung by a knot that had forgotten its duty. The oldest held the loose cord like a question. "It always falls when the game gets good," she said. He weighed the fiber with his fingers, tied a clean knot that would hold without biting, and set the height a hand-span lower so they could reach it with joy instead of strain. The tallest tested the tension, leaned back, and laughed when the net did not sag. That laugh traveled across the pad like fresh paint. 2 adults watched from half behind the jam. One held a clipboard like a shield. The other carried folded shirts for volunteers. Their eyes moved like careful birds, tracking his hands, then his face, then the faces of the children. They found nothing to alarm them. When he wiped his fingers on a rag, the clipboard sank by a small inch. He tucked the rag into his pocket and felt the flower beneath it press a quiet yes against the old stitch Sarah had made. Softness and stubbornness shared one hidden space and did not argue. He carried that into the next job. In the playroom, a fan clicked each time its tired blade hit the same bad angle. He found the spot where the cage had bent and pulled it back with 2 fingers. Silence returned as the correct answer. In the pantry, a latch had learned to stick. He reshaped the strike with a file until the door closed on a breath. At the sink, the sprayer leaked a precise sadness. He tightened the packing nut a quarter turn and dried the seam with a square of paper that stayed paper. Children shadowed him at the border of doing. They asked questions in bright, serious code. Why does it hiss? Why is that piece important? Why do you listen before you touch? He answered in small lines that fit under their lid. Air wants its path back. That part keeps others honest. Hands hear when ears cannot. He showed the difference between a screw that wants more and a screw that will strip if you demand what it cannot give. He turned the wrench like an invitation instead of a threat. A boy with a bandage on his elbow offered a toy truck that sagged on one wheel. Rain set it on the table, turned the tiny axle, and teased a strand of hair from the hub like a thread pulled from a sweater. The wheel found true and sang a straight line across the table. The child made an engine noise so faithful the room felt, for a moment, like a road. By midday, the center had found its own rhythm. Chalk games and card games. A counting song near the reading shelf. A paper chain draped like a garland over the window. The woman with the keys handed him a bottle of water and did not flinch when his fingers touched hers. That was new. She nodded toward a closet. A bolt on the shelf where we keep sleeping mats has given up, she said. I keep meaning to ask, and then the day happens to me. Let us ask it together, he said. They opened the closet where mats lay in a careful tower. A bracket held true on one side and sagged on the other. He backed out the tired screw, measured the hole with the eye of a man who has broken enough fasteners to respect them, and drilled dust from the plaster with a pocket bit. He pressed in a new anchor, drove the screw until it came true, and stopped before victory turned to damage. When he leaned on the shelf, it met him without a shiver. You can put the heavy things here, he said. Something not made of wood steadied in her face. She unfolded her arms in a way that did not hide her chest, and let a breath out that sounded like one she had saved too long. The children asked for music. Someone found a small speaker with a dent that did not ruin its purpose. A song climbed out and bumped off walls. A boy tried a dance step that made his shoes knock the floor. Someone clapped on the wrong beat and then the right one. Rains tightened a loose switch plate and listened to the room, changed tone, the way sound changes when a window rises. Outside, the fountain gave a steady shine. The generator kept its promise, laying a baseline under everything. He pressed a flat palm to its casing and felt calm travel up his arm. Good, he said softly. He checked cords for heat. They were mild as cats. Near the fence, a man in a polo watched the way people watch when they want to protect something and are deciding if help is a threat. He shifted his weight and found balance. Another adult joined him with a stack of paper plates. He knows what he is doing, the second said. I can see that, said the first. I am working on believing it belongs here. Rains could not hear the words, but he understood the posture. He kept his hands busy and his face unhurried. He swapped a bent hook for a straight one and let the net fall true. He redrew faint chalk with a stub that dusted his fingers. A child took the chalk and finished the last square, pride turning a simple shape into a flag. The woman with the keys clapped twice. An organizer's clap that makes its own silence. We are going to start the afternoon movie, she said. Who wants to count us in? A forest of hands rose. She chose a girl with a careful braid. The child counted in a steady voice. Rains flipped the breaker on the last number, and the screen woke without complaint. The cheer that followed had the clean pitch of relief. It struck the fence and came back. Not bigger, just truer. No speeches followed. Someone started the popcorn machine. The smell took over the room with the easy authority of certain comforts. Kernels snapped. Kids shouted at the tiny explosions. Rains checked the cord and found it safe. He looked at his hands and saw where Salt would live by evening. A boy in the red shirt edged up again and held out a thin strip of yellow paper. "A ticket," he said with ceremony. Rains slid it into the pocket above the flower. It rested there like a little bright wing. Later, Rains stood in the doorway. A handful of adults gathered outside the fence, with palms set lightly to the chain link, not leaning, only touching. Some had met him on the street yesterday, some had not. Together their faces made a new expression, not fear and not faith, a middle thing, ready to choose. The woman with the keys spoke to them in the tone used for schedules and weather plans. Relief sat in the chair behind her voice. One man lifted his hand and let it fall in a single clap. Another answered. More followed. No one checked a neighbor before they did it. The sound lasted just long enough to be true without becoming a parade. Rains did not bow. He turned an ear to the steady hum of the generator and touched 2 fingers to the spigot. It answered with water. He pressed his palm to the jacket and felt the pedal against the mend, a quiet pulse. He did not need to press hard to feel. The children began a chant with no words, a rolling call that matched the rhythm of their steps across chalk stones. That sound braided with the machine's hum and the soft talk of adults and the shy stutter of popcorn. Together it made a music the town had not heard in some time, or had forgotten it knew how to make whenever trust found daylight enough. The woman with the keys stood at his shoulder and watched the line of small bodies moving in patient joy. "You will come back," she said. It was not a question used to being refused. "If there is something to do," he said. "There is always something," she said. "Today is a good start." He measured the yard and the faces and the silver edge of new chalk, the weight of the flour and the old stitch, the fit of leather where it sat against his ribs. He let all of it settle in the way of a man who calibrates by feel. Then he looked at her and let a full smile find his eyes. "I will come back," he said. The projector hummed. The generator held its note. Children laughed at a scene that had been funny across many summers, and would be again. Adults eased their hands from the fence but did not step away. The yard held like a frame finely tightened, each piece sharing the weight it was made to carry. Rains stood with his tools and his 2 names, and listened as the room accepted him, the way a machine accepts a cleaned filter and a true gap and a steady hand. He asked the minute ahead for no promise. He prepared to answer it, in the language his hands trusted most. The morning carried the hush of promise, a kind of brightness that came without ceremony. Rains rode in from the west road, dust unrolling behind him like an old story. The town looked different in that light, less like a place that held its breath, and more like one that had just remembered how to breathe. He parked the Harley beside the post office where the shade still clung to the wall and watched the square come awake. The job had found him before dawn, folded in the words of the old man at the counter. The big fan's gone dead, whole squares cooking alive. Rains had nodded once, because a machine that served everyone was the kind that deserved his hands. He crossed the open bricks with his toolkit slung low, every step drawing quiet from conversation. A boy dropped a paper bag and did not pick it up. 2 women at the bakery window whispered but did not hide their eyes. Above it all, the general store's roof shimmered. The dead vent fan crouched there like a heart that had forgotten its rhythm. The old man waited with a broom, leaning on it, the way old trees lean on wind. "Been still 2 days now," he said. "Air up, there's thick enough to chew. I will see what it needs." Rains said. He climbed the back stair, each step complaining but steady. Heat rose off the tar roof in visible lines. The fan's blades hung crooked, brown at the edges. He crouched and touched the casing. The metal was hot but silent. Too silent. He turned the switch. Nothing. He cut the feed, pried open the access plate, and stared into a chamber full of dust and the tired smell of oil that had long since quit being useful. Below, the town began to gather without being asked. A handful at first, then more, forming a quiet circle of patience. Children pressed against their mothers' sides. Men shaded their eyes with calloused hands. No one spoke. Rains laid out his tools, the ritual steady as breathing. Wrench, brush, rag, bearing grease. He moved slow, careful, like a man dressing a wound. Bolts came free one by one. The burnt bearing lifted out, leaving its hollow socket behind. He cleaned it, set a new one, smoothed the belt into place. The sun burned high. Sweat traced the tattoos on his forearm, dark lines catching light like old roads. The woman with the keys from the community center appeared below, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled. She called up, "Want a drink?" He shook his head. The sound of his refusal was kind but firm. He finished the wiring, tightened the bolts again, and rested his hand on the fan's back as though it could feel reassurance. When he reconnected the power, the machine trembled once, uncertain, then turned. A groan became a spin. The spin became a hum. The hum became wind. Air rolled down across the square, tugging at shirts, lifting hats. Paper lifted and danced like startled birds. The heat broke, and the crowd broke with it. First a murmur, then a shout, then clapping that rolled like thunder through the open day. The children cheered as if something invisible had been mended inside them. Rains stood on the roof, face tipped to the new breeze. He tested the housing again. No rattle, no grind, only a steady pulse. He gave a small nod, the kind of gesture only machines understood. Below, the old man raised his broom like a salute. A woman near him started another round of applause. Louder this time. Others joined until the whole square was clapping. The rhythm began uneven, found its footing, and swelled into something that felt like rain hitting dry earth. Rains descended the ladder. When his boots met the ground, the circle opened. The smallest girl stepped forward, the same one from the center, pink ribbon tangled in her hair, and handed him a folded paper cup of lemonade. He took it. "Thank you," she said in a voice that trembled with ceremony. He drank. Slow. The lemonade was sweet enough to sting. The cup crumpled slightly in his hand, soft paper surrendering to rough skin. The grocer wiped his palms on his apron. "You fixed the air for the whole town," he said. "That fan's been begging for mercy since winter. It was only work." Rain said, "That is what mercy usually is." The man replied. Laughter moved through the crowd. Easy, unguarded. The sound mixed with the hum above, forming one note that belonged to everyone. Rains looked toward the fountain. Water arced clean, scattering sunlight like loose coins. The air no longer smelled of dust. It smelled of space. The old man from the counter came forward, motion slow but certain. He reached out a hand and let it rest on Rains's shoulder. "You brought the wind back," he said. "Not many can say they've done that." Rains only nodded. He looked at his hand. It was streaked with grease and sugar. He wiped it on a rag and felt the corner of paper in his jacket pocket. He reached in and pulled it out. A child's drawing, folded twice. Crayon marks showed the fountain, the chalk court, and the fence, all drawn whole. He refolded it carefully and slid it into the pocket above the pink flower. The petal pressed close, two soft things agreeing on purpose. The woman with the keys stepped nearer. "You never stay still," she said. "Things don't stay fixed if you do." He answered. She smiled. Behind her, the townsfolk lingered, talking in small groups, voices lighter than the day before, the sound of normal life returning. Brooms, Buckets, chairs scraping sidewalks, filled the air. He stood at the center of it all, neither apart nor inside, simply present. For the first time, presence felt like enough. The old man leaned on his broom again. "You staying a while?" he asked. "If there is something to do," Rains said. The man looked around the square, at the open doors, at faces no longer hiding. "There always is," he said. A breeze passed between them, lifting dust into harmless shapes. Somewhere a bell rang once, not as warning or worship, but acknowledgement. The sound rolled outward, joined by the steady hum of the fan above. The town's new heartbeat. Rains looked up at it, its blades cutting sunlight into even slices. The hum washed over him, filling the space where silence had once lived. He could almost hear voices inside it, faint but kind. Sarah's low laugh, Lucy's light one layered over it. He let the thoughts stay without pain. The crowd began to thin. A few waved before they went. The girl with the ribbon lingered by the fountain until her mother called her name. Rains raised 2 fingers in reply, the gesture small but certain. When the square emptied, he turned once more toward the fan and listened. The sound was not mechanical anymore. It was communal, shared, alive. He pressed a hand to the front of his jacket. The flower was still there, fragile but steady. He could feel the paper above it, the drawing, the proof that small hands still believed things could be mended. The old man started sweeping again, slow and deliberate. Dust rose, caught the new wind, and vanished into sunlight. Rains lifted his toolkit. Its weight felt right. He gave the square a final look, the shining air, the open doors, the faces that no longer flinched. The town did not thank him with words, but the wind did. That was enough. He swung onto the bike, started the engine, and let it idle for a breath. The sound blended with the hum above. Twin notes of work, completed, and peace allowed. The old man raised his hand. "See you tomorrow," he said. Rains nodded once. "Tomorrow always comes," he answered. He rode slow through the square, the wind following him, carrying the scent of cool air and oil and lemonade. The fan kept spinning, steady as faith, while the town watched him go. And in that wind, that hum of forgiveness, Eli Rains knew that even broken things could stay whole. If someone was willing to keep listening, evening eased itself across the square, a slow hush. The roof fan had taught the town to keep heat thinned into a kind breath. Screens clicked shut. Somewhere up a side street, a radio let a song drift by, and then politely stepped back. Rains sat on the store steps, with his tool roll closed at his boot, and the last taste of lemon living faint on his tongue. The broom leaned against the post, like a weary soldier on watch. The old man had gone inside to count the day, and let the bell give a single honest ring on his passing. He let stillness do its work. His jacket lay open at the throat. The flower warmed against the mend Sarah had sewn years ago, a soft oval that kept its quiet like a vow. The square no longer watched him like a stranger. It watched him like weather now, something to be expected, something that might leave and might return, and either way would not need to be explained. His breathing fell in with the far hum above. The hour after work felt like a clean plate. A shadow slid across the bricks at the corner. It belonged to no walker and not to his bike. It moved with the ease of someone who had practiced entering a place without shaking it. Rains did not look at once. A man who has learned how to stay alive lets the world speak in order. He listened first. The engine that idled at the curb did not speak the town's language. It sat low in the throat, a lazy lope, tuned for long roads and worse ideas. The sound put grease on every syllable the evening tried to say. Silence around it changed color. He lifted his eyes. The truck was old and unhandsome, paint dulled by miles. plates from a state that called dust by another name. The cab held its driver in shade. The door opened without hurry. A boot stepped down, then the man, careful in the way of someone who has paid for unwise exits. His clothes were plain but carried the memory of leather. His hands were clean in the way that means a sink under bad light has seen them often. He did not cross the street. He found the thin slice of shade under the awning, and stood there, a respectful distance and a message all the same. "Evening," he said. "Evening," Rains answered, his voice a half-tone lower than habit. The square did not need to bristle. The man lifted a palm to show nothing but a small round thing resting there, flat and familiar to anyone who had traded nights for miles. A bar coin, a challenge token, a skull on one side, a pair of wings on the other. It belonged to places where names are expensive and debts cheaper. He set it on the top step, not at Rains's boot and not out of reach. In the half-light the skull winked once and then kept its counsel. "Found this in a bar that remembers your shadow," the man said. "A fellow told me to carry it east, said he has a story only you would clean." "There are better men," Rains said. "Not for this story," the man answered, "and not for the way it ends." He did not sit. He did not dress his stillness as ease. He stood with weight spread like a man who expects wind. His eyes did old math, counting door frames, light angles, the places sound carries, and the places it dies. He was not here to boast or test. The road had sent him. That was enough. Rains did not touch the coin. He looked at the edge and saw a scrape where it had ridden a pocket with a split key and a brass screw. He smelled the ghost of cleaner on the metal. Someone had wiped it with a bar rag after closing. After the floor had been mopped and chairs turned on tables, the skull's teeth had a chip like a man who smiles around what he will not say. "Who?" Rains asked. The man named a person Rains had not heard spoken in years of weather and fuel and silence. The sound of it pressed a knuckle against his ribs. Not a blow. A reminder. He let his face stay calm and left breath to its duty. The man kept laying parts on the towel. "A place," he said. "A warehouse near the drainage ditch, where the water never quite leaves. A back door with a burned bulb. A set of units behind a wire fence. The kind men rent under another name when they mean to keep their true name clean. One lock that lies about its resolve. A phone that rang inside, when no phone should be there to ring." He spoke time with patience, not the dead middle. He said, "Late, when men's slow. A day from now, that is what I was told to say." "Who told you?" Rains asked. The man moved his jaw like a pebble, had found a tooth, and was working at it. He lifted one shoulder. "A fellow who trades favors and owes one he is tired of owing." He said, "No patch, a memory of one. He spoke your riding name like a debt, and wanted it settled in the clean way. He did not look like peace. He looked like a door that would rather stay shut." The fan above drew a long breath and let it go. Someone down the block laughed at something harmless, and the laughter stood without apology. Birds settled on the wire like notes on a staff. Rains pictured the back room. The burnt bulb, the lock that pretends to argue and then gives up, the ring that means a trap or an apology or both. His hand went to the jacket without thought. The flower warmed under his palm, soft and stubborn. The mend below it ran like an old riverbed under a new bloom. Sarah's stitch had never asked what storms the cloth would meet. It had only promised to hold until the work was finished. "If I go, and it is what I hope it is," Rains said, "does it cost this town?" The man shook his head. "This place is air and sun to me," he said. "They will not drag their trouble across a square that finally learned to breathe. The story sits 2 towns over. You enter by your will and leave by the same. And if I do not go," Rains said. The coin lay still, a small moon on the step. The man looked past Rains, and for a moment his caution uncloaked his history. The road had rubbed him thin. Kindness had not rubbed him at all. "Then they will call your phone," he said. "Then they will find a way to make you remember a number you threw away. They will put a hand on a shoulder you respect and lean until bone complains. Men who leave without paying teach interest to grow tall." He did not raise fear. He set a truth down where it would not roll. Rains looked at the door grain worn smooth by men who came in with small problems and left with nails, and the promise that tomorrow holds. He looked at the broom with the shine where the old man's hand had lived. He looked at the fence corner he had set straight, at the window where a child had pressed a palm when the fan first found wind. He thought of the woman with the keys, and how relief had finally sat down inside her like a person instead of a cloud. He thought of mornings that behaved. He picked up the coin. It held a little heat from the step and a little cold from the pocket where it had slept. The skull met his gaze without need. He turned it until the wings caught what remained of the sun. He thought of noise, and of music, and of men confused between the two. Then he slid the coin into the pocket above the flower and above the folded drawing the child had pressed on him. Metal-kissed crayon, soft and hard together, a stack of small truths laid in like shims until the fit held. "What wants mending?" he asked, and for a breath his old name stood beside the question. The man took a careful beat. He rubbed his thumb along the clamp of his belt as if smoothing a wrinkle that would not matter to anyone else and mattered to him. When he spoke, his words were spare. "A ledger you did not write," he said. "A lie that keeps its own motor running. A story about a knight that took a wife and a child and then tried to take the part of a man that knows how to bring anything back. I do not think they offer closure. I think they mean to break a thing that learned to heal. There was no ribbon to put on that." The square tilted inward and listened. Rains kept surprise outside like weather. He did not name the way the world sometimes folds and hands you a shape it should have hidden. He did not need a name. He owned the language of tasks and proof. "Where?" he said again. "Quieter." The man told it the same way. Exact turn, careful landmarks. The wire fence with its gap, where hands had stained the links, the sign with the letter missing, the change in sound when a boot met the lip of the ditch. He gave the smell of the place, hot rubber and stale water and powder that used to be rat. Rains took it in the way he measures torque and gap, and the count he keeps inside his head when he closes a job clean without cracking the face. Rains nodded once when the picture sat whole. "Who are you to this story?" he asked. The man tried a smile and it broke in the middle. "A messenger," he said, "and a man who owes you a slice of silence from a time you looked away, while I fixed my wrong. I want that paid to the proper side. That is all." He had no patch and nothing to sell. He had done the errand the road had written on him. He would not sweeten it. Rains stood. The step creaked where he set his weight. Far down a dog told the night no, and the night agreed to wait. Dusk lay down on the square like a blanket. A careful hand had spread. He slid the tool roll behind the door, where the old man would find it if morning arrived without him. He wrote nothing. A chain of custody does not always put ink first. He looked at the man. "Ride with me to the turn," he said. The man lifted his chin a fraction. "I will set you on the road," he said, "and let the rest be your work." They crossed to the curb. The truck waited with the patience of a beast that knows sky better than garage. Rains swung a leg over the Harley and settled to the shape that knew him. His palm found the pocket once more. The little stack of proofs pressed together, flower under drawing, under coin. He started the engine. It answered low and willing. The bell inside the store rang once, as the old man returned with his ledger under his arm. He looked at the two of them, at the line of the evening, and did not ask, He set the ledger down and fixed the wedge under the door, like a man who knows a person might be out late and a light should be waiting. His nod carried no ceremony and still bound itself like law. Rains rolled into the street. The truck fell in behind, with distance held just right. They passed the fountain, flashing a little silver under the lamp. They passed the center, where a paper chain still draped the window like an easy promise. They passed the ball field where chalk would turn to faint dust on shoes until the rain came. Windows watched without fear. The fan's steady breath rode his shoulders for a few heartbeats, and then let him go. At the edge of town, he lifted 2 fingers without turning and took the road the man had named, not quick and not slow, exact. The highway open, long and low, the kind that teaches the ear how to tell noise from music. He did not pray and did not argue. He let leather warm where it thinned. He let the flowers steady the place where a heart keeps names. He let the coin press its cold promise into the map that lived under his skin. He rode toward a door that did not knock, toward a room that had borrowed his past and refused to return it, toward a light that burned wrong against a sky ready for night. He rode with both names and with the work of his hands and with the soft weight in his pocket that had learned to answer even the roughest road. Behind him the town settled into its wind. Ahead, the warehouse waited, and the truth inside it waited too. Night took the road without a quarrel. After the messenger peeled away at the promised turn with a small bow of headlights, darkness folded shut behind him, and Rains rode on with the thin cone of his lamp laying a silver ribbon ahead. Wind leaned at his shoulders, not as an enemy now, but like a steady hand at the back of a man who means to walk through. He eased off the throttle a mile before the place and let the machine coast. Clutch pulled. Engine quieted to a held breath. The warehouse lay low behind chain link and weeds. A long iron box sewn with bolts and old rain. An orange bulb above the back door burned wrong. Not bright, not dead. A bruise of light that made the metal look sick. The drainage ditch carried nothing but a faint smell of water that had forgotten how to move. A fox slipped through the thistle and did not glance at him. The night took his outline and set it down again where it needed him. He found the gap men had taught the fence, easing wire aside, the way you ask a question of a sleeping house. He waited for the mesh to settle back, listening for any note of alarm, any wing, any shoe. Only the thin tick of cooling metal answered. The back knob wore a lock that wanted to be believed. He set 2 fingers on the face and felt cheap certainty under heavy varnish. He did not shove. He slid a flat into the seam and let quiet pressure do the work. The latch surrendered the way a lie does when patience arrives. Inside, smelled of hot rubber and stale water and powder too fine to be dust alone. Rafters hung low with the weight of old seasons. A drip somewhere counted time that no one had ordered. Rains let the dark set its table, and then drew a narrow ribbon of penlight along the floor. Aimed low, the beam found scuffs and chalk, heel marks that had been wiped once and not twice. Far back, a single ring of a phone rolled through the hush. Not a call so much as a test, a thumb on a bruise, to see if tenderness still lived there. He did not answer with his feet. He listened until the drip returned to the job of keeping time. Metal doors lined both sides, shoulder to shoulder, each with its own silence. He walked the row at an even pace, reading the small stories people leave without meaning to. A number traced over itself, a patch of clean where a hand rested, a smear at hip height where a habit had worn the paint thin. The unit named on the roadman's map waited at the end, its padlock more theater than guard. He rolled the shackle in his thumb and heard grit gathered where rain cannot reach. A tilt, a patient turn, and the lock came off without having to be persuaded into drama. He lifted the door a hand's breadth and waited for a lesson he had forgotten. Nothing. He raised it slow, until the metal chose to hold. The room was a pocket made for secrets. A table, a chair with one leg honest and three uncertain, a plastic crate, a steel cabinet with a bowed door, a battery lamp with a dead stare. He gave himself a count, not for fear, but for steadiness, then stepped in down the center line, shoulders level, feet high, the way you enter a place that might test you just to know what you are. On the table, a cheap recorder lay on its back, face cracked, a red diode blinking its patient pulse. A wall calendar torn to a month-long past leaned under a thumbtack. The paper ringed where an oily hand had pressed over and over. An envelope with an insurer's crest had been slit with a key and folded again with care. The crease, sharpened by worry, he did not touch. He let his eyes do the work and allowed the room to learn that he could leave a thing where it lay. The cabinet drew him, quiet as a held breath. He laid a palm to the steel and felt a faint, living hum. No key. The flat again, the tongue found and eased. The door opened like someone who has made peace with losing. Inside, a recorder for cameras blinked in an old green. Stubborn. Alive. Below it, drives in a neat stack wore letters in marker. On the small screen, the date stamp stood in simple digits no one had cared to hide. One view showed the back door and the ugly orange bulb. Another showed the corridor he had walked, the very door he had lifted, and in the washed light of the lens his own shoulders squared. He lifted his chin without thinking. The thread at his collar caught a flash. The stamp wrote "the moment" at the bottom edge in plain truth. He checked the power strip, counted load, and tripped the switch off and on. Not to break anything, only to mark. Chain of custody begins in the choices you make before a stranger asks what you did. He set a clean rag beneath his fingers and opened the plastic crate. A ledger waited there, spine cracked, pages wincing between covers. Printouts smelled of fresh ink. A manila folder carried a case number in black pen. He moved each thing as if it could brew. Traffic cameras. A line read, "Parts and install." The date fell in the month when he had been sending love through a crib rail and laughter through doorways. The month before a drunk at a light had turned a road into a wall. A maintenance ticket followed. Urgent. Sensor fault at the north mouth. Intermittent all day. Repair deferred. Rain coming. And in the margin a friendly felt-tip smile of a note. Use caution in reports. We do not need delay. He turned the page and found a name from a road he had walked away from. A boyhood bit of pride, hammered into an adult signature. A curve of first letter he would know in the dark. The phone rang again. Once, as if embarrassment had learned to speak, he let it go quiet. He lifted the ledger and looked for holes. They were there, clean jumps, where the walk should have stayed step. He put it back where it had slept, and let his silence say he believed it. A shoe scraped the corridor, not creeping, not startled, confident, the stride of a man standing inside his own story. Rains moved a half pace, so he could see the opening without offering his face. He waited. The first to appear wore arrogance, like a jacket that no longer fit. He smiled before he checked the room, and when he saw Rains sitting in the middle of his plan, his smile held, because men who spend on lies learn to spend on posture also. Two more came behind him, men shaped by easy force and bad sleep. The first clapped once, a soft sound to test echo. The room gave it back the same size, still gentle with locks. The first man said. He stepped the way a ballroom teaches, as if floors loved him. He let his glance drift over the table. The red diodes blinked, the cabinet's mouth open like a wound. He believed he could rebrand. A collector. He tasted the word as if he might own it. I fix what breaks. Rains said. His voice made no threat, and offered no apology. He watched hands. He watched jaws. He watched the man in the rear, because gravity likes to hide in the quiet corner. The first lifted a finger and pointed without looking. Theater taped onto habit. "That calendar is mine," he said. "That recorder is there so weak men can listen to their own lie later and call it courage." His laugh knocked against the steel and fell dull. He rapped the cabinet with his knuckles in a private rhythm, a metronome of vanity. The camera light winked, writing his tapping and his face into small green certainty. Rains crossed to the breaker panel where a cover hung loose like a torn lid. He dropped the room dark and then lit again, not to spook, but to stamp. The men did not know why the action felt like a sentence being pronounced. They only knew the room had been asked to remember. "We used to ride under colors." The first said, "Look at you, shutting off lights like a clerk. Your woman and child did not die because a form asked for a delay. They died because the world pulls cords when it pleases. Do not be small." The words slid off the metal and landed like paper missing a basket. He kept talking, as vanity must. He spoke the intersection by name and got it almost the way a liar always gets it. He tried on the time and wore it wrong. He draped fog over a night the sky knows was clear. Lies begged to be art. Truth goes about in work clothes. Rains did not answer heat with heat. He answered with proof. He lifted the insurer's envelope by its corners and rolled the flap to show code and case, date stamped for the day after his world had been rewired. He set it where the two quiet men could read without confessing they were reading. He touched a button on the cabinet recorder that marked a clip. A small square tone spoke, and the margin clock marched along. The cheap device on the table blinked red to no one at all. The first man stepped back half the length of a breath, not enough to name, enough to mean. His mouth primed a new story, and then betrayed him by pausing. He reached for charm and found it had slipped off somewhere near the door. So he did the thing men do when they feel the ground go soft under the heel. He kept talking. The repair was delayed for a crew that never came. The sensor glitched at intervals, and who could be blamed for rain that arrives in its own time? A bottle had flown a light. Blame lives with the bottle, not the circuit. His pitch rose over the last defense and cracked on the word feet. Rains left the crack hanging. He drew a clear bag from his roll, the kind that once had kept screws paired with their home, and slid the envelope inside. He sealed, dated, and initialed in small plain letters. Not for show, for record. He spoke the place and hour in a voice steady enough to put ink on air. He laid the bag on the crate and rested a finger as one does on a page that will be photocopied later. He pressed the clip button again. The recorder gave its quiet tone and went on writing. The first man stared at the sealed line of tape the way a cat eyes a slick of water. Want ran through his face and could not cross the threshold. He looked to the others. The near man shook his head, in a motion so slight it could have been a fly. The far man kept his eyes on the blinking green and on the marching time, as if the future had walked in and sketched a careful square around his shoes. Rains labeled the drives, steady hand, plain facts. Each slipped into its own clear sleeve and closed. He did not hurry. He let breath carry weight. When it was done, he stood with his palm finding the jacket pocket. Light touch, the flower's warmth against coins cool, the folded drawing a thin bravery between. The first man tried one last shape of himself. He edged around the table as if nearness could smear the clean. Rains did not give ground or invitation. He stood like a post sunk to frost line. The man's grin drooped and showed the work it took to wear it. He cut his eyes toward the camera and, for the length of a blink, saw himself from a day he did not wish to meet. "You think you have something?" he said, more to the lens than to the room. You have paper, you have wire, you have the sad breath of a machine telling you what happened. The world does not sit for machines. Rains gave him the sentence machines offer when treated with respect. They speak without fear. He said, that is why men argue with them. Silence took a slow walk around the space. The first man made a move that wanted to be a shove and arrived short. Rains met his wrist with the easy pressure a mechanic uses to stop a bolt before it strips. No flourish, just a limit set. And held, he let go at once. Trouble craves the extra second. He gave it none. You will walk out, Rains said. Voice even. You will decide which lie to try next. The record will hold, whether or not you do. If you had meant to vanish this, you would have pulled power and drowned drives and broken what tells the truth. Vanity loves a red light, blinking. That will unmake you. The word vanity found an edge and cut. The first man stepped back, mouth raw, language, looking for a better owner. He turned, and the others followed in their earlier order. No door slammed. Pride had asked for it. Fear declined. Their footfalls went down the hall and then were done. The cheap latch found itself, and for once it sounded like a thing performing its honest task. Rains stood with the hum and the drip and the little green eye that had done its clean work. He slid the bagged envelope, the labeled drives, the ledger, the folder into his pack, set the cabinet door back where its hinge could keep its promise, and lowered the unit door to the same height he had left it. Rooms that keep accounts notice. Such courtesies. He walked the corridor and stepped back into night. The orange lamp still held its bruise. He lifted the side cover, tightened a loose neutral, and seated the bulb just shy of stubborn. The light found true, and turned the right kind of white. There, he said, to the door and to the air, and to a part of himself that has always preferred repair to blame. This entrance had been lit for the wrong story too long. He crossed the fence where the wire remembered him and rolled the bike out of the ditch shadow. He did not start at once. He let the night assemble. Far off, thunder spoke in a voice that might have been weather or the long road clearing its throat. He set his palm to the pocket where soft and hard rode together. The flour was warm. The coin was cool. The drawing stood between, a child's faith turned into paper spine. He did not press. He did not need to. When the engine found its breath, the sound did not break the quiet so much as join it. He swung into the lane and let the line under him become a sentence he could finish. Proof rode in the pack against his kidneys. Purpose rode under his heart. He turned his face toward the town that would be sleeping with one light burning because an old man had said it so. The bell there would give one clean note when he rolled in, not warning, not worship, acknowledgement, and in the morning he would carry the truth to the desk where such things are received. Let signatures gather in the right order. Let time codes become ink. Let a lie lose its motor. He rode with both names and with the work of his hands. The hum beneath him no longer a road to outrun, but a rhythm to keep. Ahead waited paper and process, and a door that would open for what he had gathered. Behind him, a building sat under a lamp that no longer lied. Between the two, the wind made space for a man who had learned that even the roughest soul can bloom again. When someone chooses to see the human inside the giant, and that the way to honor that bloom is simple, show the receipts, and let the truth stand. The heart of the pink rose reminds us that redemption doesn't always roar. It often hums quietly beneath calloused hands, doing honest work. Eli Raines's journey from exile to restoration isn't about vengeance or public vindication. It's about the courage to face what's broken and fix it. One bolt, one truth, one small act of integrity at a time. His story shows that silence, though it can feel safe, is rarely the path to peace. Only when we confront what has been twisted, whether it's an injustice, a prejudice, or our own sense of guilt, can healing take root. The story also speaks to anyone who's ever been misjudged or misunderstood. Sometimes the world only sees the jacket, not the man wearing it. Reigns teaches us that dignity is found not in what others believe about us, but in what we choose to keep repairing, inside and out. As the old saying goes, true gold doesn't fear the fire. When life burns away the illusions, what remains is what's real. The work, the truth, and the quiet strength to start again. If this story stirred something in you, maybe a memory, a reflection, or even a question, share it in the comments. What part of Eli's journey spoke to you most? Tap like if you believe in stories that heal through truth, and subscribe to join us for more human stories that balance justice with grace. May your road ahead be honest, your hands steady, and your heart at peace. Because even after the harshest storms, something gentle can still bloom again.